Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
Leaders are effective insofar as they can tell stories. And stories are not only about where we've come from and that we have a deep history and that we're part of something, but also where we're going. And so people feel a sense of purpose and vision. And again, this is how humans evolved around the campfire telling stories. That's what resonates with us more than facts. And as you said, like early in the conversation, that's part of the key of a good book, is it not just has rigorous evidence in it, but it also has stories. And the way we wrote our book, for example, is to find what the evidence was and then find a good story that became a vehicle for that piece of evidence. So other people would share it and engage with it and tell other people. If you do a good job of designing and telling stories that communicate facts, you'll remember the lessons from it.
Hello, and welcome to episode 84 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind global community for leaders and culture champions who want to learn new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures at scale in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. The CultureBrained Community is where we come together to answer some pretty darn hard, ungoogleable questions about culture. And our members get to participate in things like weekly huddles, masterclasses, flash mastermind groups, and talks from world-class experts on culture. And you know many of these experts from this podcast. But most importantly, we facilitate deep peer-to-peer connections. Because making work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, it's definitely not a task for a single person. It requires tapping into the collective wisdom of bold, kind, and curious culture leaders who are on a mission to redefine and, frankly, decrapify work. So if this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, check it out at tiny.one/CultureBrained. And don't worry, you don't have to write it down. There is a link in the show notes. Today, I have the author of a book that was one of my top picks for the CultureBrained leaders in 2021. Was the book The Power of Us? Who's the author? Jay Van Bavel. Jay is an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at New York University. And from neurons to social networks, Jay's research investigates the psychology and neuroscience of implicit bias, group identity, team performance, decision-making, and public health. For me, Jay is the new Adam Grant because he's really making psychology and neuroscience accessible, fun, and applicable in how we run our organizations. Jay lives in New York with his family and pet hamster Sunny. And once he told me he taught a class while trapped in an elevator with his son and his daughter. Jay is so much fun to talk to. So without further ado, here is Jen Van Bavel in a conversation about how we can put the science of social identity into practice so that we can increase performance, improve company culture, and create more of a sense of belonging for our people.
My name is Jay Van Bavel. I'm an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at New York University and the director of the Social Identity and Morality Lab. And I essentially study group psychology, what makes groups get along, what drives prejudice, how you can get rid of it, how you can make groups smarter and avoid things like groupthink. And I have a new book called The Power of Us, which is essentially a book to give people the tools to build and manage smarter groups.
I love this book, and I'm so keen to talk about your book. I actually think it's one of the best books. Well, I rated it as one of the 3 best books for CultureBrained leaders to read. It's wonderful. So we'll definitely talk more about your book. But before we go there, there's one question I always ask to every single guest on the show. And the question is, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? How did you grow up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll just put it in contrast. Right now, as I'm doing this podcast, I'm in lower Manhattan, right by the NYU campus where I work.
Mhm.
And I grew up pretty much in the opposite corner of the earth as this. I grew up in rural Alberta in northern Canada in a town of 2,000 people with no radio channels, no movie
Wow.
theaters. And so it's pretty much the cultural opposite of the type of environment I'm in now.
Yeah. And how do you think that impacted the way you show up in the world?
I mean, one of the things that I've had to do as I've gone through life, as I moved away from my hometown and I went to university in Edmonton, which at the time felt like an overwhelmingly massive city to me. And then I moved to Toronto, which was even bigger and more diverse and cosmopolitan. And then I moved to the United States. One thing I've benefited from is meeting new people and adapting to my environment. So one of my skills, I think, is that I'm a bit of a social chameleon, that I can figure out and adapt to different cultural contexts and get along with people from all walks of life. And so I think that's one of the core themes of our book, is that people aren't fixed in terms of their identity, that they contain multitudes, all kinds of different identities, and those become active in different situations. And you can harness that to navigate the world and be successful and connect with other people and enjoy life.
Yeah. It's such a useful capability to have, being a social chameleon. Why do you think Canadians are generally so nice and lovely as a nation? Let's start with that.
Yeah, so obviously that's a good stereotype of Canadians. Canadians love to hear it. I will say that my fiance likes to point out that that's not always good, because Canadians are very good at being friendly, and sometimes they're not as honest with you as they might be. Whereas in New York, it's very much people are super direct with you, and if they're frustrated with you, they say it. Whereas like how I grew up in my family is like always kind of look on the bright side, always try to be positive. So much more like a Canadian stereotype.
Yeah.
But I do think it's part of the norms of trying to get along with people. And when I grew up, one of the things that I was told to do the first time I ever left the country, I saved up money for a year and went on a tour group to Italy with my high school. And my mom told me, like, you put a Canadian flag on your backpack so other people will see you're from Canada and they'll think you're like a nice person. And so that's kind of like you're hoping to capitalize on this stereotype when you go into the world.
I love this.
And it was funny because I was in Venice. Of course, because I'm a kid from Canada, my free time, I had a chance to go get lunch. So I go to McDonald's, of course, instead of all the amazing food, the world's best food in Venice, Italy. Instead, I go to McDonald's and I'm standing in line, and this teenage girl comes up and just starts talking to me in English, in a
Hmm.
place where almost no one is speaking English. And she had saw my Canadian flag. And
There you
so
go.
she ended up saying hi and connecting with me and felt a sense of trust with me. And she also spoke English. And for both of us, it was this huge relief to find someone who could at least just share our language and cultural reference points in a way that we probably never would have spoken with one another if we were in Canada. We just would have been strangers. And so that's one of the cool things. It's kind of like a bat signal. You send out this identity into the world, and other people who share it reach out and connect with you.
Yeah, I love it. I absolutely love it. And it's so, so true. By the way, do you know that I used to live in Venice for 2 years?
Oh, wow. So you just know how good the food is in Venice and how stupid I was to be going to get fast food, right?
Was it the McDonald's near the Ferrovia station, the train station? I guess that in
It
that
might have been.
neighborhood. It's probably the only one that they have over there. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I found the one that they had, of course.
Yeah. Unless there are new ones now, but I don't think so. Okay, so let's talk about your book. So as I've mentioned, I loved your book, and you co-authored it with Dominic Packer. And, when I read it, I thought, wow, this is really one of the best nonfiction books that I've read this year. But I couldn't quite put my finger on what sets it apart from other books that I've read. And then I came across this Venn diagram from Adam Grant that basically identifies the sweet spot where really great nonfiction books sit. And I was like, yeah, that's it. Jason Dominic's book basically meets all the criteria. So it has novel insights, engaging writing, rigorous evidence, and practical takeaways. So speaking of engaging writing, I want to start here. You start the book with a bang. It's a story that really made me laugh out loud, actually, but also go, yep, I totally, totally recognize that feeling. So can you share the cheddar story with our listeners and what it teaches us about social identity, about bonding and belonging?
Yeah. Okay. So this is kind of like, a lot of books have an origin story of the author. we co-wrote this book, Dominic and I. So we talk about the origin story of us as a collaboration. And it really started when I, was a graduate student. I moved to the University of Toronto and I was told just to pick an office. And I grabbed this office it's called the sub basement, which means it's the basement below the basement. There's no natural light down there, but there was a free desk. And so I grabbed it in this office with Dominic Packer, who was a graduate student a year older than me. And I don't think he was happy to share his office, which he had to himself. And, we got off on the wrong foot. I brought in my hockey equipment. My first weeks, I had no room for it in my tiny apartment. And bringing in a giant bag of stinky hockey equipment is not the best way to endear yourself to your newest office mate. And then a few months in, I think it was about 6 months in, we were at a guest speaker had come and given a talk. And we were at this really fancy wine and cheese. It certainly felt fancy to me at the time. And we're talking about the presentation and the research we were doing with some other students. And all of a sudden, I wasn't paying attention. I was eating as much free food as I could because I was pretty poor at the time. And I took this cube of cheese and put it down my throat. It was about the size of like a dice or die. And I got clogged. And I tried to drink it down with a beer and it got even more clogged. And so that was obviously a bad turn of events for me. And I suddenly realized that if I didn't get this out, I was going to die. The oxygen just gets cut off to your brain very quickly. And I had actually worked in Northern Alberta in the oil field for several years to pay my way through college. And I had watched, dozens of safety videos because it's a very dangerous place to work. And one of the lessons I remembered from those safety videos is that if you ever choke, your instinct is, because it's very socially embarrassing to do this in public. And your instinct is to go somewhere private and try to dislodge whatever's choking you. But that's actually how people die if they're choking. You should never leave the community. You have to override your sense of embarrassment and humiliation because there's almost always someone there who can give you the Heimlich. And so I realized I can't leave, even though this will be humiliating for me. I went behind the bar because there was a strapping young bartender. He looked like, the best equipped person to dislodge this thing. And so I went behind the bar to him instead of, one of these old professors. And he kind of eventually realized what I was doing and tried to help it. And it helped a little bit, but not completely. And by now, a lot of the people and the senior professors and stuff who I was trying to, impress were staring at me behind this bar with this guy kind of reaching around, putting his arms around me, trying to give the Heimlich. And I was kind of embarrassed, but I realized I need someone to help me. So I grabbed Dominic's hand and we went to the men's room and I was able to communicate what he needed to do. It took a while for it to register in his brain. And then slowly he was able to give me the Heimlich and it came out. And it was funny because he was mortified by this because he realized he didn't really know what to do that well. And I almost was dying and it would have maybe been his fault. I thought it was hilarious. I started laughing because I realized what a great way to end my career, die at a wine and cheese in your first year of graduate school. So I wanted to go back in and get another drink and have some more cheese. And he was horrified. And so he immediately just went home. He was really upset about it.
Oh my gosh.
And but after that, it became the bond for our relationship that we had gone through this kind of pretty intense, rare life or death experience together. And from then on, we were able to talk and help each other. And he became my mentor. And now 20 years later, we're still collaborating. We wrote this book. And so extreme experiences, there's lots of research on this. And some tribes in Brazil do this. They put young people through this extreme experience. And this is their transition into adulthood. If they go through this, it's kind of like an initiation ritual. And of course, fraternities and sororities do this. A lot of groups do these intense rituals so that people feel a lifelong connection to the group.
Yeah, I love that. And I'd love for us to unpack it and think about, how and whether there is a space for rituals like that in companies and creating experiences that are deeply bonding experiences. But before we go there, I just want to ask you, if you were to unpack this experience, because for me, it was really striking to think about. I had a very similar experience, by the way, once when I hit my head at a social gathering. There was a window that was open and I raised my hand really fast and I just hit the corner of the window frame. And I pretended that it wasn't that bad. And then blood was just streaming down my forehead. And I was so embarrassed that I absolutely refused to acknowledge what happened. So I totally get that feeling of not wanting to be embarrassed because our need, I guess, to belong or to be socially acceptable is so incredibly strong. And so I just find this fascinating that we would choose death over embarrassing ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say there's lots of surveys on this. And if you ask people what their biggest fear is, people will rank in some surveys public speaking over death.
Mhm.
And you're like, why are they so terrified of public speaking? And the reason is because if you think back to how humans evolved, we evolved in small groups. We don't have camouflage. We can't fly. We're not poisonous. We don't have sharp teeth. We're not particularly fast. And so we would have been picked off very quickly if we were kicked out of the group. And so for humans, our key evolutionary adaptation that allowed us to not only survive, but thrive and spread around the world is our ability to cooperate and communicate. And even today in research, one of the biggest single findings in social psychology is that if people are kicked out of a group, it is a horrifying experience. If you're told no one wants to work with you or no one likes you, your IQ plummets about 15 points, almost instantly. You become really upset and distressed, and you'll do almost anything you can to get back in the group.
Yeah.
And so we are the ancestors, you and I and everybody listening to this, of generation after generation of people who could fit in to a group. The people who did not fit in did not pass on their genes. And so we are not ancestors of the people who are unable to fit in. We are the ancestors of the people who fit in. So that's our brain. That's how we are wired to find and fit into groups. And so you can just think of like a huge amount of our psychology is fundamentally oriented to that goal because it's so primitive in our sense of survival and basic needs that threats to it, like humiliating ourselves in giving a public speech or choking at a wine and cheese, we experience them as much more devastating than they actually are.
Yeah. Let's double click on this and also go back to even your book's title, which is The Power of Us. And what makes us us? So, because you say in your book, for example, 150 people on a plane, they are not necessarily a group. They don't have a group identity, but the flight attendants on the same plane, they do. So what's the difference? What makes us us?
Yeah. So when you have a shared sense of purpose and often a common goal, that builds an identity. And so when I go on a plane ride, the person sitting next to me or in front of me or behind me are just individuals. Often I'm not even engaging with them. I get on a plane, I open my book I brought to read or watch a movie, or for me, actually usually open my laptop so I can catch up on my writing. But the moment that there is a common goal, so we have this great, academic paper about a hijacking. This woman who was a social worker got stuck on this plane that was hijacked and held in the desert in Jordan for several days. And she talked about how all these individuals on the plane over time quickly became part of a unit, and they started rationing food, supporting one another, helping with the kids. And so they built an identity around a shared goal, which was their shared survival. And so this is often what happens in many cases. If you're a flight attendant, you have a uniform that's the same. You have an identity as a flight attendant. So you actually have a role that you all share. You all have to cooperate and coordinate to make the flight a success. And so those people already have an identity. But the passengers, anybody can create a new identity with almost any group under whenever the circumstances require it or permit it.
Mm-hmm. One of the elements that is necessary to create a shared identity, as you said, is common goal. Would you say there are other elements that need to be in place for people to feel like they really have that shared identity and they belong to the group?
Yeah, I mean, this is some of the research I've been doing in my lab for the last few decades is all it takes to create an identity is to flip a coin. And so if I bring a bunch of people into a room and I flip a coin and put half of them on the blue team and half of them on the red team, within minutes, they'll start liking their own group more. They'll identify with them more. Often they'll create a team name. They'll be more likely to work together and trust one another. They'll pay more attention to who's on their team and look at their faces and start to see them as individuals and not just part of a category. And I've done neuroimaging studies where I've flipped a coin and put people on groups, and then we put them in the scanner, and we can see almost instantaneously changes in their brain activation in terms of how they're looking at people who are part of their team. And so that's really all it takes for humans to join a group and feel a sense of identity. But then once you have that base, you can layer on all kinds of other things. If they're in competition with another team, then everything gets amplified. That they look to each other and to group leaders, especially for what the norms are. So you can create a new group and the norms can be very discriminatory. Like, we're going to really get that other team. We're not going to cooperate with them. We are going to get really nasty to beat them. Or the norms can be very inclusive. They can be like, we really value difference of opinion and diversity and dissent. And we really try to connect with other people who are different than us and find ways to work with them. And so the leaders, once you're in a group and you have an identity, you look to other group members and also the leaders about what that identity means. And that's the big determinant of how you behave.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, bringing it into a corporate environment, for many organizations, what they do relatively well is obviously there is a name, there is a symbolism and artifacts around who we are in terms of the organization. Obviously, there are shared norms as well. But as you say, sometimes these norms are not necessarily conducive to bringing the best out of our behaviors when we really identify with a group. I want us to have a conversation a little bit around that, because obviously a shared identity comes with a lot of positive aspects. Like, it's easier to trust others. It's easier to collaborate. As you say, we pay more attention to each other, right? There's a lot of positive stuff.
Yeah.
But also there are some downsides to it. So I'm curious, what can we do to hit that sweet spot where you get the positive stuff, but you avoid the negative stuff that is linked to having a strong shared identity?
Yeah, that is the big question, I think, for organizations and teams. So, as I said, the key thing is figuring out what norms you want to have. And so, like, one of the downsides of groups that, most people are familiar with is groupthink, that groups can generate like a overwhelming pressure for conformity with whatever the leader is saying. And so it turns out that there's ways that you can reduce groupthink. And it turns out that the leadership needs to be strong in that case, but it needs to reinforce and value things like dissent and difference of opinion and diversity of perspectives and willingness to challenge the status quo. And leaders can do that in lots of different ways. So, for example, I run a research lab at New York University. If I have a new idea and want to propose it to the group, I'll share the report with everybody or the paper, and then we all get together. And I will not share my opinion first. I wait for other people to weigh in and share their opinions, because if I have a strong opinion and say it first, people might not feel comfortable expressing yours. They don't want to embarrass me or be seen as challenging me. And so you have to create the situation that allows them the safety and comfort to challenge it. It also means, like, if they're challenging one of my ideas, I can't get reactive or defensive. I have to say, that's a really interesting idea. And I have to, if it's a good idea, update my thinking and be willing to go with it. If I'm constantly just defending my own thoughts and perspectives, then people will quickly realize it's not a safe space for them to express challenging perspectives. And so one of my favorite studies on this was called Project Aristotle. It was run by Google. And they analyzed over 100 teams, and they tried to crunch the numbers. Google's one of the best analytic companies in the world, and figure out what the data said about why some teams were better than others. And it wasn't the leadership structure, whether it was vertical or horizontal. It wasn't the personality styles of the teams. It wasn't whether they went out for drinks after or just only hung out at work. The only single thing they found in their data that predicted team success was psychological safety. And this is not the feeling we often hear about on the news, where everybody can no longer challenge one another and it's a quiet, safe space. No, it's the opposite. Psychological safety means people can challenge each other or present new ideas or propose a wild idea or take a risk, and it won't be punished. In fact, you can challenge the person who proposed an idea or the boss, and then you come back the next day and you're still part of the team and valued just as much. And so that's what the kind of vibe is you want to have in a group. And so that's to avoid groupthink and create a sense where people are comfortable, especially people from diverse perspectives. And then the second big piece, which we did actually cover in this book, but we're now thinking about our next book would be a big piece, is reducing social loafing. And so one thing that can sometimes happen in cohesive groups is, and we've all been part of like a group assignment where we end up getting stuck, working late the night before and no one else shows up and we have to do it all. So people have bad memories of that when they've worked in groups sometimes. And so what you need to do is reward the contributions of individuals on the team. But it's not just who did the best, it's who helped the team be successful. And so I'll give a corporate example I saw of this that was excellent. I gave a talk once at a keynote address at Canadian Space Agency. So this is like NASA, but in Canada. You walk in, and once you get in through security, you see this wall of all the astronauts. And these are like famous people on the front pages of newspapers. They have book deals. They're on TV and movies. And of course, they're taking huge risks going to outer space. So they deserve some credit, right? But as you go deep into the space agency, they had this other wall. And I was like, who are these people as they're giving me the tour? And they said, these are the unsung heroes. I think it was every month they identified somebody who was kind of like in the trenches, in the space agency, doing the critical work that made the launches and the Mars rover and the space arm successful. And everybody on the ground floor knows who those people are. They're not going to ever be on, the TV or on the front page of the newspaper, but they are the critical people, the linchpins to team success. And so they have a way of recognizing, rewarding those people and giving them very similar status internally to the astronauts.
Yeah.
And so that is one of the things. You have to identify people who are critical to group success and reward them and give them social status for that, because groups run because people are willing to chip in, help out others, do mentoring, help out behind the scenes, fill in when other people get sick or stressed or overwhelmed. And so you have to find ways where helping the team succeed, even if they're not getting the credit for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so, so important. I love this example so much because when you think about culture, what it becomes is really what we reward or what we punish. So if you find ways to celebrate teamwork and people going out of the way to support others and so on and so forth, and also these are unsung heroes, as you say, that I think each organization has people who are not that visible, and making them visible and acknowledging that is super powerful. So I love that example. Obviously, our listeners are very familiar with the idea of psychological safety, and that's super important as well. I love the definition that the guest on the podcast that we had recently, Timothy Clark, has of psychological safety, which is, he says, it's an environment of rewarded vulnerability. And I think it's such a short and very, very accurate definition of what it is, because it's really when you speak up, for example, when you disagree, you are being vulnerable, you are open to risk, and you trust that your environment is going to reward this. This is amazing. So are there any other elements that you can start working on to make sure that the strong shared identity is not going to derail your culture?
Yeah, I think the other big piece, and we have a chapter on this, is leadership. And so a big part of building a great culture and creating healthy norms is the role of the leader. And so the leader can't just say that this is what we value. In fact, in many companies, you'll see, they have these really impressive mission statements on their website, and those are held up publicly as if this is the value of the company. But once you get into the organization, you'll see that no one actually is following those or takes them seriously, or even thinks that the leadership takes them seriously. And so what people actually do, in their cubicle, or, now it's mostly virtual, is they look to other people like them.
Yeah.
And also look to the people who are getting promoted and the leaders about what they're actually doing, not what they're saying. And so they're looking to see what's getting rewarded by the leaders and what the leaders are doing in terms of their own role modeling. And so a key thing for leaders to change a culture is they have to embody it. They have to do the things that they say are important, and not only do them, but be seen as doing them.
Yeah.
And so if they're not really committed to doing these themselves or rewarding them, then other people will simply not do them. They'll look around to see what's getting rewarded. I'll say this, one of my favorite books on corporate leadership, that kind of the dark side of it, is called Snakes in Suits. And it was written by an expert in psychopathy. And what his research finds is that as you move up in organizations, you find a higher and higher ratio of people with psychopathic characteristics. And the reason for this is because those people are able to have sharp elbows. They step on people below them. They take credit for stuff they didn't do. They find a way to get into the limelight. They find a way to talk to someone in power and convince them that all the ideas were theirs. And then they climb up. But these people are terrible managers. They destroy the culture. They create like a dog eat dog kind of environment where no one's willing to help one another. And if you see people like that getting promoted, even if you would normally be a helpful pro-social person, you'll just be like, why am I going to bother if that's what gets rewarded here? I'm just going to adopt that kind of personality style. And so you really have to be careful, because I think a lot of organizations might not intend to promote people with those traits, but they're accidentally doing it. And then they're having these consequences and they don't quite know why, no one is engaged at work, or they can't retain their top talent. And we're seeing this right now massively, that there's this massive, I guess it's called a mass resignation. Everybody's leaving their job and moving to another job. Well, there's research on this. The single biggest predictor of why people are leaving is they don't feel a sense of belonging or connection at work. Yep. It's not about money. It's about culture and leadership.
Yep.
And I saw one data point yesterday from one study from, I think it was some MIT business school.
Mm-hmm.
And the culture that you have matters 10 times as much as the compensation in terms of your decision to stay or leave.
Yeah,
And I saw another data point, this was just stuck with me, is that if you have a best friend at work, it's the equivalent of a $100,000 a year salary increase in terms of your happiness.
totally. Totally.
So, because that's our human nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are things that intuitively, I think we all know, right? That they matter and they are important. And yet I find it extremely important also to have evidence that actually supports that like that. And I've seen that, data point as well yesterday. And the number one factor that people have identified as a reason for them leaving their jobs right now in the Great Resignation has been a toxic culture. And I think you are absolutely right that the people who create those toxic cultures are leaders, right? Because what is culture at the end of the day is the relationships that people have and what's happening between people. So Jay, I totally agree with you that what's important is what we see people role model for us. And then we, of course, because we want to belong, we copy these behaviors. And I guess that a lot of people are now grappling with this challenge. Like, how do we make those behaviors visible when everyone is working, or if not everyone, a large group or a large part of our organization is working from home? So we no longer can actually observe our colleagues at work. Do you know of any good practices that overcome that hurdle? What can we do in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work?
Yeah. So, first of all, I'll just say there's a massive study from Microsoft. I think they analyzed 60,000 people's like email and calendars, and they found most people are working reasonably well from home and they're still connected to their immediate collaborators and team leaders. But what's been lost is connections between people across the organization. So now we're very siloed
Mm-hmm.
in our virtual work environments. And so the problem for that is not that we don't meet our like weekly or daily targets. It's that most of the innovation is gone because most innovation comes from connecting with people who are at different teams than you. And so organizations might not realize it and individuals might not realize it, but there's, I think, an invisible loss in those connections across the organization. So there's a couple things. I'll just say one thing I've done in my lab is because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to come in as much and we're doing actually excellent work, mostly remote. But I now have people coming in probably 2 days a week when we can and on those days, it's really dedicated to social interaction. It's our one-on-one meetings. It's our team.
So it's like a clubhouse, right? The
Yeah.
office becomes a clubhouse. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we use those days to connect with one another and we prioritize that on the days that we're all in. And then that gives people the social connection and the social capital to help each other out and trust to help each other out when we're virtual. So I think that's one thing organizations should do is when you are in, people shouldn't be in I see this in some organizations and I see it at work sometimes. People come in, but then they're just like in their office with their door closed on Zoom meetings all day long. And so if you're going to do that, just stay home.
Yeah, totally.
So that would be the first thing. And then I would also say this, that organizations that are willing to do this, build a culture and also allow people to be hybrid or virtual are going to outcompete all the others because right now all the data suggests people want to be virtual or at least hybrid part-time and people are pretty effective at it. And so in a white collar world where you're competing for talent and there's bidding wars for top people and you want to retain your top people, that's going to give you a huge advantage. And so I would say most of your mental effort then should be to how can you build connection either virtually, platforms like Slack are useful for helping people informally just stay in touch and share jokes and be connected. But also when you are in person, dedicate it to building relationships and social community in a way that probably you didn't ever before.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how do you interpret that as an identity researcher? What's the reason that people actually seem to prefer to be working from home?
Yeah, I think people prefer to work from home, because they don't want to commute. Sometimes it allows us, I would say, especially for parents and especially for mothers who bear most of the burden in our society for childcare, it allows them flexibility. Like I'm home right now working with you. My son is home because he's got a cold and he can't go into school, even though he's negative for COVID because he has a cough. And so I'm able to do this podcast with you and do my research meetings while kind of helping my son get through the day. And so that is an enormous opportunity that's lost if we go back to the old way.
Yeah.
And so I just don't think that we're going to go back to it because it affords too many benefits for people. The other obvious one is that people can afford to have a bigger house and live further away and kind of optimize their life on other dimensions in terms of like quality of life and proximity to family and things like that. Time with your kids, maybe exercise in the middle of the day. You're able to do that now.
Yeah.
And so it has so many benefits if it's harnessed well. It's just that, like everything in life, we want to maximize the good and we want to understand, by analysis and data, to understand what the downsides are and then find strategies to mitigate those so we can really bask in all the good things without having all the downsides.
Yeah, exactly. And so going back to the potentially lost innovation, because I think this is one of the fears that a lot of our listeners have, and especially people who are in charge of culture shaping projects, they definitely think about, how do we create those creative collisions where people bump into each other and just talk about stuff. So one thing that you have mentioned already, when you bring people into the office, let them just mingle and socialize and make it the whole purpose of coming into the office. Have you seen organizations implementing other interesting approaches that are aimed at increasing innovation while everyone is working in the hybrid or remote model?
I haven't seen, partly because I haven't been in organizations as much. A lot of my talks and so forth have been virtual. But I will say that I've seen it in the scientific universe, which I'm in, is that some labs and some communities have done this specifically. And this is specifically what I've done too. The other thing we've done is I've had throughout the entire pandemic, I study COVID and collective behavior during COVID. And so one of the things early on you notice is that meetings outside are incredibly safe. And so I had social gatherings outside frequently for work events so people could connect and see each other. And they really appreciated just seeing each other and being connected, even if it was informally. And they liked doing it outside. And so there's ways to do it safely, but you need to prioritize it. One thing that I found that has been harder, and I haven't seen this done really well anywhere yet, is like social gatherings in virtual platforms.
Yeah.
And so I know there's this huge industry out now trying to do it, but there were some, it was just like the holidays and all these companies normally have their holiday party. I think I saw one survey, it was on LinkedIn or something, that was only like 8% of people actually want to do a virtual holiday party. And so, but it's kind of like the criticism of these things historically is when companies kind of like mandate fun. It's like, it's not as fun if no one actually wants to do it. Yeah. People want to do that social connection, at least. People have been good about doing it, like I think over video platforms where everybody has a glass of wine and share stories or something. You can still have like a happy hour. That I've done this with friends. It's actually not so bad. But some of the platforms I just think are not well suited to recreating the natural environment in which the human brain evolved and connected and built trust with one another socially.
Yeah, it's true. I've seen some attempts and they are getting better, but we're definitely not there yet. I want to ask you because I think with all the research and knowledge that you have, I cannot not ask this question. If you're a CEO of a company, how would you use everything that you know about shared identity and how it influences behavior to cultivate an innovative and inclusive culture that enables people to do the best work of their careers? Where would you start? Like, what would be your first thing to do to make sure that you leverage, all that knowledge that you have as a researcher?
Yeah. So I think I maybe like a 5-step plan would be realizing that identity is important and building one and making people using collective language, that we're all in it together, finding ways to reward collective performance. Right now, companies are really good at rewarding individual success. Science is great at this too. We're really bad at figuring out how to incentivize group success. And then there's lots of research on how to do it. So that would be another thing I would do, build in group awards on top of the individual performance rewards and evaluations. The next thing I would do as a leader is leaders are effective insofar as they can tell stories. And stories are not only about where we've come from and that we have a deep history and that we're part of something, but also where we're going. And so people feel a sense of purpose and vision. And again, this is how humans evolved around the campfire telling stories. That's what resonates with us more than facts. And as you said, like early in the conversation, that's part of the key of a good book, is it not just has rigorous evidence in it, but it also has stories. And the way we wrote our book, for example, is to find what the evidence was and then find a good story that became a vehicle for that piece of evidence. So other people would share it and engage with it and tell other people.
That's what I loved about your book. It's really the stories are so great.
You'll remember those stories for years and years, long after you forget the specific facts. But if you do a good job of designing and telling stories that communicate facts, you'll remember the lessons from it. And so leaders need to think of like, what lessons do they want to communicate? What norms and values do they want to communicate? And find stories. And a story could be like, we have this janitor who did this amazing thing, went over and above to do this. We're going to tell the story of this person, and you're going to get to know them. And then even long after you forget the specifics, you'll remember kind of the lesson of it. This is like, storytelling's been around forever, probably partly to tell like lessons, right? To kids.
Yeah, totally. Can I quickly share something with you here? So
Yes.
This has been my light bulb moment as a culture consultant who helps companies codify their culture. So like really uncover what's our authentic cultural DNA and when we are at our best. And I worked for organizations like PwC and Hay Group and Korn Ferry with very traditional approaches to doing those things. And I realized that we were not tapping into how our brains are wired and exactly that thing around how culture has been developed for millennia around those campfires. And so from the moment I started doing an exercise that I now call a fireside chat, where people share stories of us at our best. And then people who listen to it, each person listens with a specific lens and they decode these stories for values, for mission, for purpose, and so on. This was the moment where I started hearing from client organizations, oh my gosh, this is so us. And this is so authentic and so genuine. The stuff that we had before, it was aspirational, but it really didn't reflect who we are. And so I thought, wow, we had to go to these stories to really uncover that cultural DNA. There's just simply no other way. So I really resonate with that.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I'd layer on to that is that these stories are going to work more if they're authentic. I think there's often a notion from leadership that they want to reach a goal and they'll backfill in some story to get people there. But people see through that. This is why it's better to dig deeper and find out what your DNA is and find out what the examples of the people doing the thing that you want other people to adopt, and then build on that, because then it's true. It's going to resonate with people. And when they see it being rewarded and those people being held up in positive esteem, they're more likely to copy it. And so that's where you get to norms. What you're essentially doing at that point is building social norms by rewarding and holding up the examples of people who embody the norms that you value. And so that is also like something that I see endlessly getting ignored, but that seems to be in social psychology, one of the single biggest predictors of behavior is just social norms. It's really simple. It's really basic. It's really powerful. And yet, I guess maybe it's not counterintuitive or clever enough. And so I very rarely see it harnessed in organizations. Everybody's always on to whatever the next trendy thing is, instead of like, this is something we have 60 years of research on that actually works really well for all kinds of parts of human life. So that would be the last piece.
Wait, because people are going to kill me. Let's definitely double click on that last piece, because I agree with you. I think we haven't really figured out how we can leverage that. And so back to your plan as a CEO, how would you go about it? Like, how would you leverage the power of social norms in your organization?
So I'll give you a multi-step process. One is embed the norms in your messaging. So a famous study once was done where people were stealing petrified wood from this petrified forest in California. And there was a warning to people. Don't steal petrified wood. Too many people are stealing it. And therefore the forest is going to be all gone. And they thought, well, that's a good warning. But it led people to steal more wood because the message was communicating it was social proof, was communicating everybody stealing the wood. Yeah. So therefore, if I want to take a little piece, I guess it's just part of the norm.
It's okay. Yeah.
And so then they changed the message. This was Bob Cialdini, who's the master of this stuff. They changed the message to say that actually most people are not stealing the wood.
Yeah.
And therefore, we don't want you to steal the wood either, because it will ruin the petrified forest. And the people are less likely to do it if they learn that most people aren't doing it. And so you really want to make sure your messaging communicates the norms that you want. The other thing is you want to find people who are doing the right norms and then find ways of shining a spotlight on those people. That's like the example of the Canadian Space Agency, where they had the unsung heroes. They're finding people who are doing the things that they value and helping the group, and they're putting a spotlight on them. Everybody gets to see their image, hear their little story. There's an applause. There's presumably also an email that goes out to everybody, or you can announce it at a team meeting. And so you want to create norms around that. The other thing I will say is think carefully about your norms. So this is one thing in my lab that we stumbled upon, but makes a lot of sense once I thought about it, is we built a great norm around celebrating everybody's successes. And then one day at lab meeting, someone just shared a negative thing that had happened to them that week. They'd had a paper rejected. That's in my world, that's a bad thing. And then we started helping them work through it. And then somebody else shared an example of a paper they had rejected. And we all brainstormed and helped them. And they felt socially supported and they got help to figure out and got better. And so now we've made that a new norm that each week I not only now successes that people have had in the room to make it a culture of success and to help other people see success as possible, but also we talk about failures because those are natural and normal. And it's important. If you take risks, you're going to have failures. And so that's actually like a healthy sign in a culture, at least in the culture that I work in. And then also it creates social supports. It makes it normal to talk about failure. And it actually allows you to crowdsource solutions to those failures to make everybody more successful. And so that is now part of our norms. So you have to think a bit more holistically about the norms. You don't just want to have a culture where you only ever talk about successes, because then it might make people who are struggling but could benefit from help, or have like a risky idea, but it might fail, but it would be amazing if it worked. You don't want those people to feel like it's not a safe space for them to speak up. So that's the other thing, is there's kind of like other norms you might want to cultivate that you might not be aware of. Yeah, so we have to think really carefully and critically about it.
Yeah, I love that. And I know of organizations that are very, very intentional about that. Speaking of failure, like really framing it also differently, that this is an opportunity to learn, right? So we look at those things and we try to figure out what went wrong there and how we can avoid doing this in the future, or just gauging whatever else there is in terms of learning for the future, which I think that's the whole point, right? Because you don't want to approach it in a judgmental way. You want to approach it as an opportunity, just as success is an opportunity. I love that.
Yeah, the term is, I'll just say the term is growth mindset. You want to have an individual growth mindset, but you also want to have an organizational growth mindset, so that the goal of your team is to constantly get better. And that you always assume that you're never as good as you can be. And so you want a culture that part of taking risks and making failures is so that we can figure out what works, so we can keep doing the good things and learn quickly about the things that don't work.
Right. Absolutely. One last question then, because as you've mentioned, growth mindset, I think is an interesting area to dive into for a minute or two. People do have identities that are constraining and self-limiting. And I think it can also happen to teams in organizations. And I wonder if someone has this challenge with their team, or they identify as a team that, I don't know, never meets their goals or something like that, and it does become embedded in this collective identity. How do you undo it? How do you help a team overcome a self-limiting belief like that, or an identity?
I think first thing you need to do is figure out, are your goals unreasonable? Maybe you need to set like more reasonable middle level goals. And then the next question is try to figure out why you're struggling. Is it a failure of group decision making, or is it a failure of coordination, or do you have toxic individuals who are holding you back from being successful? The research shows that if you have an office near somebody who has a really toxic personality style, your performance drops. In fact, everybody on the whole floor suffers from being around somebody like that. So I think you need to diagnose what the problem is, and then you need to address it. And this is also like part of the goal of collective psychology, is crowdsourcing ideas and suggestions. This is something that very common to me, which is that if I'm trying to solve a problem, I crowdsource it to my entire team. And almost always I come up with a better idea than if I had just thought about it myself, because you're harnessing.
How do you do it? How do you frame it? I think it's a useful thing for people to learn. Like what's the process then?
I'll just give you an example. So I'm teaching a class of 360 people starting Monday. It's Introduction to Psychology. And so I posted on social media that I'm trying to come up with more interactive, memorable activities for people to learn. I have great lectures. Students love the class already, but I want to kind of take it to that next level so that they're thinking about it 5 years from now.
Right.
And so I want these like interactive things that they'll do to drive home the lessons for them.
So you frame it as basically as, how do I question? How do I make it more interactive or whatever?
Yeah.
And you put it out there for people to.
Yeah. I said I'm teaching this course.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any suggestions about how this can be better with engaging interactive, challenges for the students? And I must have got like 40 people sending me their suggestions, and they're emailing me the stuff that they do in their classes. And so it's easy to do this all the time. You're basically admitting publicly you don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
But in doing that, you're kind of admitting a little bit of intellectual humility, but also then you're harnessing your network or your team's ideas in ways that are almost always going to be better than yours. And if they give you bad ideas, you can always just say, thanks for the idea. I'll think about it. But almost always in my experience, they have like 2 or 3 ideas you never thought about that are excellent that they've already tried out. And so I do that all the time. I do that in team meetings. I do that on my social media when I'm trying to figure something out. There's a whole book's written on the wisdom of crowds. Partly what you're doing is harnessing the wisdom of crowds. And then also people like it because it gives them a voice. People love to give advice to other people. In fact, it makes them like you more. If somebody does you a favor, there's an ironic classic research finding where they actually like you more if they helped you out. So it has so many benefits for building relationships, making what you do more effective, and giving people a sense of voice. So I do that all the time.
Yeah, I love that. And if any of our CultureBrained community members are listening to that, it just goes to show that you shouldn't hesitate to reach out to others and ask them for ideas, because people love giving their ideas and they will like you more as well. So it's an extra benefit. Thank you so much for that. I wish we had more time because I have so many other questions, but I'm mindful that we will have to wrap it up in a moment. So let's shift gears a little bit and go to our rapid fire questions. The whole idea is that I'm going to ask you 5 questions in rapid succession, and your challenge is to try and answer all 5 in under 2 minutes.
Fire away. Let's do this.
All right, let's do this. So, how do you define organizational culture?
I define organizational culture as the actual behavioral practices of the average person in the culture.
What is the sign, or perhaps signs, plural, that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
Some quick signs, these are like canaries in a coal mine, is that people aren't comfortable speaking up. That implies that you have a problem with groupthink, that people don't trust one another. And that implies that maybe it's like a dog-eat-dog, sharp elbow type of environment. And maybe the next one is that they actually feel a bit lost. And that's a suggestion that like leadership is not giving them a clear vision about what to do.
What company do you admire for the culture and why?
There's several cultures that I admire. I think one of the ones that I admire a lot is Patagonia. I think they have a great leader, and what they do is they feel like they have a purpose and vision, and their customers seem really proud with the product. And so I think that in my next book, that was one of the organizations I'd love to talk to the leader there about how she built the culture.
Patagonia, are you listening? What books on culture or leadership would you recommend?
Oh man, there's so many good ones. It's hard to think of like my favorite ones. I think one of the ones that I just listened to that was really good was Katie Milkman's book on how to change. And it's really linked to, she grounds it in really incredible behavioral science it's about individual change.
Yeah.
But towards the end, it talks about social norms and how effective those are in groups for change. And so that was one I read this year that struck me as like really deeply grounded in science. The other big one I would say is, I already referenced in Bob Cialdini's book, Influence, which is now on, I think it's 6th or 7th edition. He's just one of the best researchers in the world on norms. And the book is so fun and filled with stories and easy to read and just grounded in really great expertise.
I agree. Yeah, a wonderful book. What is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
I would think of rewarding people who promote the culture that they want and value. And so find somebody in your group who's doing the little behaviors often behind the scenes that kind of are examples of the great cultural environment that you actually would want to work in and that other people would want to work in. And then give those people social status. Often just recognizing them publicly matters more than a corner office. But of course, if you can reward them financially, that's great too. And they'll feel valued, they'll do more of it. And other people, when they see them getting rewarded, will also be likely to do more of it.
Yeah. Jay, if our listeners want to learn more about you, about your work, about your research, what are the best online places that they can go to?
Yeah, I would just go to our book website called powerofus.online. And we have summaries of every chapter, summary of our book, reviews of our book. You can buy the book if you want, but of course, read the reviews in the summary to see if it's interesting to you. We also have there a free sign up to our newsletter, which goes out every couple of weeks. And it's designed to make people smarter about groups and give them the tools to build smarter groups, whether they are CEO of a Fortune 500 company or they're the coach of their daughter's soccer team. We think that people are parts of all kinds of groups in society, and we want them to get better at all elements of managing groups.
How am I not signed up to this yet? Something went wrong there. You definitely have to advertise it more because somehow I missed it.
Yeah, it's also free, so that's another perk.
I'm definitely signing up for it. Definitely. Jay, thank you so much for making the time for this conversation, but most of all, obviously, for your work. It's needed and it's been so enlightening just reading your book and learning from you. So I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on, Aga.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. Jay and I hope that it will really inspire you to think broader and deeper about cultivating a shared identity in your business. And if you'd like an opportunity to interact with Jay and other guests of the Culture Lab podcast in live sessions, really intimate and interactive sessions where you can learn more on the topic, well, this is just one of many benefits that you'd enjoy if you were a member of the CultureBrained community. CultureBrained is a one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders, people who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures, especially now in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. So if you are in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, you'd probably feel right at home in our community. It's a truly diverse group of culture leaders, from Fortune 100 to tiny startups on a rapid growth trajectory. And what brings us together is a passion for cultivating a healthy culture at scale. We are guided by our values of being bold, being kind, and being curious. And you know what? We'd love for you to join us, especially if it feels the right fit for you. You can learn more at tiny.one/culturebrained, and you'll find the link in the show notes. So now, a quick preview of the upcoming episode. My next guest is Dr. Dante Vaughan. He's one of the authors of a book called From Culture to Culture, and he's also a co-founder of CultureWorks, a company that helps leaders cultivate a healthy culture based on their values in real time. In this preview, Dante talks about breathing life into your culture in a way that makes it real and tangible. So tune into this episode if you are interested in how to take a proactive approach to your culture.
How do you begin to breathe life, and we speak to this in the book, back into your culture in a way that makes it real and tangible and relevant to your business and your employees? Because how they connect to those values are imperative in their ability to practice and embody the behaviors that come with those values on a day-to-day basis. So we believe that part of the challenge is simply has been, if you treat those values in a very flat, stagnant, almost marketized way in your business versus being a framework by which everyone is supposed to show up and engage and make decisions every day, then you already lose momentum in your ability to truly impact that company culture.
Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: tinyurl.com/Aga Bayer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire Culture Lab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabayer.com and let us know.